Hey there, fellow insomniacs and midnight wanderers. Welcome back to another journey through the dusty, slightly smelly corridors of history. Tonight, we're diving into a tale that'll make you grateful for that bar of soap sitting in your shower. Yes, we're talking about medieval people and their absolutely fascinating fear of baths. Picture this. It's 1347. Not the time, the year. You're living in a bustling medieval town somewhere in Europe. The church bells are ringing, merchants are haggling in the market square, and you? Well, you haven't bathed since last Easter. And before you judge yourself too harshly, neither has anyone else. In fact, if you suggested taking a bath right now, people would look at you like you'd just proposed jumping off the cathedral tower for fun. You see, while we modern folk see bathing as a basic necessity, like eating or complaining about the weather, medieval people saw it as something between a dangerous gamble and a moral failing. A hot bath wasn't relaxation, it was Russian roulette with soap. So grab your coziest blanket, maybe light a lavender-scented candle if you're feeling fancy, and let's dive into one of history's most peculiar fears. The medieval terror of getting clean. And hey, if you're enjoying stepping back in time with me, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, but only if you want to. I'm not your medieval overlord. Before we begin our journey through the unwashed ages, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing everyone gathering around our digital campfire, sharing where they're tuning in from. Ready? Let's step back about 700 years and find out why your ancestors would have been absolutely horrified by your daily shower routine. So here you are, waking up in your medieval dwelling. Let's call you Aldrich, 23 years old, apprentice to the local blacksmith. The rooster hasn't even crowed yet, but you're already stirring on your straw mattress. The first sensation that hits you isn't the cold morning air or the ache in your back from yesterday's work at the forge. No, it's that familiar feeling we all know so well. That slightly sticky, been too long without washing sensation that makes you want to scratch everywhere at once. But here's the thing. Unlike you in your modern bed, reaching for your phone to check the time before stumbling to the shower, Aldrich isn't even considering a bath. The thought doesn't cross his mind. It's been 2 months since his last proper wash, and that was only because his master insisted before the Easter feast. Even then, Aldrich approached that wooden tub like it was filled with liquid plague. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely people back then understood basic hygiene. Surely they made the connection between dirt and disease. Well, yes and no. They understood cleanliness, but their definition would make your skin crawl. Literally. See, in the early medieval period, things were actually looking pretty good for personal hygiene. The Romans had left behind their legendary bathing culture. Public bathhouses dotted the landscape of many European towns, like coffee shops in Seattle. These weren't just places to get clean. They were social hubs, entertainment centres, the medieval equivalent of your local gym and spa rolled into one. Picture walking into one of these bathhouses in, say, 1100. The air is thick with steam and the scent of herbs. Rosemary, thyme, sage, all thrown into the water to create a primitive aromatherapy experience. Musicians play lutes in the corner. Someone's selling meat pies near the entrance, because apparently nothing says clean living like eating a questionable meat product while you soak. There are different pools for different temperatures, and contrary to what you might expect, men and women often bathed together, though separated by a flimsy wooden partition that did about as much for modesty as a sheer curtain at a window. The water was changed, occasionally, Let's not dwell on how occasionally, but the important thing is that people were bathing, they were socializing, they were even conducting business deals while neck deep in communal bathwater. "I'll trade you 3 chickens for that cow," one merchant might say to another, both of them pruning like raisins in their 3rd hour of soaking. But then something changed, and that something was a combination of moral panic and medical misunderstanding that would make modern conspiracy theorists look reasonable by comparison. The church started getting nervous about all this naked socializing. What begins as innocent splashing, they reasoned, could quickly lead to activities that would make the angels weep. Some bishop somewhere probably had a vision of bathhouses as the devil's own recruitment centres. "Come for the hot water," Satan whispers. "Stay for the eternal damnation." It started with sermons, gentle suggestions that perhaps spending too much time in warm water was making people soft. Not just physically soft, but morally soft, spiritually squishy. The kind of soft that opens the door to temptation, sin, and worst of all, enjoyment. Then came the regulations. Bathhouses should close on Sundays, then on holy days, then during Lent. Soon, there were more days when you couldn't bathe than days when you could. It was like trying to schedule a dentist appointment, but for your entire body. But the real nail in the coffin of medieval bathing came courtesy of the medical establishment. And by medical establishment, I mean people who thought leeches were the solution to everything, and that the human body contained 4 humours that needed to be kept in perfect balance, or you die of an excess of bile. These learned men, stroking their unwashed beards, came up with a theory that would change European hygiene for centuries. Hot water, they declared, opens the pores. And open pores are like open gates to a city under siege. Through these tiny gateways, all manner of corruption could enter the body. Bad air, evil spirits, disease, disappointment, the plague, your neighbours gossiping, everything terrible could apparently squeeze through a dilated pore. The logic was almost beautiful in its simplicity. If you never bathed, your pores stayed closed. If your pores stayed closed, disease couldn't enter. If disease couldn't enter, you stayed healthy. It was like believing that if you never opened your windows, burglars couldn't get in, while completely ignoring the fact that you're slowly suffocating in your own stench. And speaking of the plague, oh boy, did the Black Death seal the deal on the whole no bathing thing. When the plague swept through Europe in 1347, killing somewhere between 1/3 and half the population, people noticed something terrifying. Those who bathed seemed to die faster. Now, we know today that this correlation had nothing to do with bathing itself. The plague was spread by fleas on rats, not by clean pores. But medieval people didn't know about bacteria or disease vectors. All they saw was clean person equals dead person, dirty person equals maybe still alive person. The math was simple and terrifying. Imagine being a survivor in a post-plague town. Half your neighbours are dead. The local bathhouse owner? Dead. That woman who was always going on about the importance of washing behind your ears? Super dead. Meanwhile, grimy Guillaume, who hasn't seen water since his baptism, is still walking around, healthy as a horse. What conclusion would you draw? The fear became so intense that doctors began prescribing dirt, actual dirt. As a protective layer against disease, they recommended that people cultivate what they called a protective crust on their skin. This wasn't just accepting a bit of grime. This was actively encouraging the development of a personal fortress made of dead skin cells, sweat, and whatever else accumulated on the human body. One physician wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here because the original Latin is even more disturbing, that a proper gentleman should have a complexion like well-worn leather, tough and impermeable to corruption. He wasn't talking about a nice tan. He was talking about the kind of skin that could deflect arrows. Young Aldrich, our blacksmith's apprentice, inherited this fear in his very bones. His grandmother told him stories of the plague years, of how the cleanest died first. His mother would cross herself whenever she passed the old, abandoned bathhouse on the edge of town. The building stood empty, its doors barred, windows broken, a monument to a more hygienic, but apparently more dangerous time. So when Aldrich wakes up feeling grimy, his solution isn't water, it's acceptance. This is the armor God gave him against the corruption of the world. This is his protection. Plus, everyone else smells the same, so who's going to notice? But don't think for a moment that medieval people were content to wallow in filth. Oh no, they had standards. They just had different standards. Very different standards. So, what exactly did our friend Aldrich do instead of bathing? Well, prepare yourself for a masterclass in creative hygiene that would make a modern germaphobe faint. First and foremost, there was the linen strategy. This was the crown jewel of medieval cleanliness, the hack that let people feel fresh without ever touching water. The idea was elegantly simple and completely bonkers. Your linen undergarments were like a sponge, soaking up all the oils, sweat, and general funkiness your body produced. Change the linen, and voila, you're clean. It was like changing your bedsheets and declaring your mattress sanitized. Aldrich owned 3 linen shirts. 3! That made him practically middle class. 1 to wear, 1 to wash, and 1 to dry. He'd rotate through them like a very slow, very smelly fashion show. Every few days, off came the dirty shirt, on went the clean one. The dirty shirt would be boiled, beaten with rocks by the river, and hung to dry. No soap, mind you. Soap was expensive and suspicious. Just good old-fashioned violence against fabric. The wealthy took this to extremes that border on the absurd. Noble ladies might change their underlinens 3 times a day. 3 times. Each change was like a rebirth, a renewal of purity without the dangerous act of bathing. They had servants whose entire job was managing the linen rotation. Imagine having that on your medieval resume. Professional undergarment coordinator. 5 years experience in strategic linen deployment. But the real magic happened with the outer clothes. These were rarely washed. Washing fine fabrics was risky, expensive, and frankly, unnecessary when you had perfume. And medieval people had perfume, like modern people have air fresheners. They put it everywhere. In their clothes, in their hair, in little pouches around their necks, probably in their food, if they thought they could get away with it. Aldrich couldn't afford real perfume, of course, but he had herbs. His mother taught him to rub sage leaves under his arms, to tuck sprigs of rosemary into his belt, to chew mint leaves before talking to anyone important. It was like a walking garden, if gardens smelled faintly of armpit. Then there was the dry cleaning method. Not dry cleaning, like we know it, with chemicals and plastic bags. This was literal dry cleaning. Rubbing yourself with a rough cloth until the dead skin and dirt came off in little rolls. It was exfoliation taken to its logical extreme. Some people used ashes mixed with herbs. Others preferred sand. Yes, sand. Because nothing says clean like the feeling of being a human sandcastle. Aldrich's morning routine was a marvel of efficiency. Wake up, scratch vigorously, change linen if it was a linen-changing day, rub down with a cloth that had seen better decades, apply herbs, and he was ready to face the world. Total time, 5 minutes. Modern influencers with their 17-step skincare routines could learn something. But the real revelation was vinegar. Medieval people loved vinegar, like modern people love hand sanitizer. They rubbed it on their skin, rinsed their mouths with it, even washed their hair with it. Walk through a medieval town, and under the smell of unwashed bodies and horse manure, you'd catch the sharp tang of vinegar. It was the Febreze of the Middle Ages. The logic was sound, sort of. Vinegar killed smells. It had that sharp, clean scent that suggested purity. And it probably did kill some bacteria, though medieval people would have called them evil spirits or tiny demons. The downside was that you smelled like a salad. But between smelling like a salad and smelling like a cesspit, the choice was clear. For hair care, things got even more creative. Combing was crucial. A good bone or horn comb wasn't just for detangling, it was for removing what medieval people delicately called visitors. Lice, fleas, and other tiny passengers were so common that finding someone without them was suspicious. Too clean meant too proud. Too proud meant too sinful. Women would spend hours combing each other's hair, not just for beauty, but for pest control. It was social grooming taken to its logical conclusion. They'd oil their hair with scented oils when they could afford it, or rub it with cloths soaked in herb water. Some even used eggs as a hair treatment, though given the general lack of refrigeration, this could go wrong in spectacular ways. Men kept their hair shorter, usually, but beards were another story. A proper beard was a symbol of masculinity, wisdom, and authority. It was also a thriving ecosystem. Crumbs, wine, yesterday's stew, all could be found in a well-established beard. Some men wore beard bags while eating, little cloth pouches to keep the worst of the mess out. Others just accepted that their beard was essentially a portable snack storage system. For dental hygiene, the situation was actually not as dire as you might think. Medieval people cleaned their teeth, just not with toothbrushes. They used cloths, sometimes rough linens dipped in salt or herbs. They chewed twigs, especially from trees like birch or willow, which actually contain compounds similar to aspirin. Some even used primitive tooth powders made from crushed shells or charcoal. The real heroes of medieval tooth care were the barber surgeons. These multi-talented individuals would cut your hair, trim your beard, pull your teeth, and if you were really unlucky, amputate your limbs, all with the same tools, probably. Their shops were identifiable by the red and white poles outside, the red symbolizing blood and the white symbolizing bandages. Nothing says, "Trust me with your mouth," like advertising how much blood you spill. But here's where it gets really interesting. Despite all these alternatives to bathing, medieval people did wash specific parts of their bodies regularly. Hands were washed before meals, not just for cleanliness, but as a social ritual. In wealthy households, servants would appear with basins and pitchers, pouring scented water over guests' hands before dining. It was performance art with a practical purpose. The ceremony of hand washing was elaborate. The water had to be the right temperature, the towels properly scented, the basin held at the correct angle. There were rules about who washed first, who poured for whom, how many times you could dip your hands. It was like a very boring, very specific dance. Feet got special attention too. After a long day of walking through medieval streets, which were essentially open sewers with aspirations, foot washing was both practical and symbolic. It had religious overtones, reminiscent of biblical foot washing. Many people washed their feet every night before bed, sitting by the fire with a basin of warm water, finally removing the day's accumulation of mud, manure, and mystery substances. Aldrich looked forward to his weekly foot washing. Every Saturday night, his mother would heat water over the fire, add a few herbs if they had them, and the whole family would take turns soaking their feet. It was the highlight of the hygiene week. The foot water would turn colours that don't exist in nature, but everyone would sigh with contentment. The face was another exception to the no water rule. Most people splashed their faces in the morning, if only to wake up properly. Some even used rose water or other scented waters if they could afford them. The contrast must have been striking. A relatively clean face atop a body that hadn't seen water in months. Women had their own secret weapons in the war against grime. They used white lead for their faces, which gave them that fashionable pale complexion, and probably also gave them lead poisoning. But beauty standards have always been questionable. They plucked their hairlines to achieve high foreheads, removed their eyebrows entirely sometimes, and used belladonna to dilate their pupils, because nothing says attractive like looking constantly surprised and slightly poisoned. The contradictions were everywhere. People who wouldn't dream of submerging their bodies in water would spend hours on elaborate grooming rituals. They'd pick at their skin with special tools, trim every visible nail to perfection, and spend fortunes on clothes they'd never properly wash. It was a world where appearance mattered intensely, but the methods for maintaining that appearance would make a modern person weep. Where cleanliness was next to godliness, but actual cleaning was next to satanic. Where smelling good was crucial, but achieving that smell involved everything except soap and water. Now, you might think that if anyone was going to break the no bathing rule, it would be the wealthy and powerful. After all, they had money, servants, and private chambers, where they could indulge in whatever suspicious, water-based activities they wanted. But here's the beautiful irony of medieval hygiene. The richer you were, the more elaborate your excuses for not bathing became. Let's leave Aldrich at his forge for a moment and climb the social ladder to visit Lady Isabel de Montmorency, a noblewoman whose family castle overlooks the very town where our apprentice blacksmith works. Lady Isabel, 28 years old, mother of 3, owner of more dresses than days in the year, has not taken a proper bath in 6 months, and she's proud of it. You see, among the nobility, not bathing wasn't just about avoiding disease, it was about maintaining divine favour, social status, and moral superiority all at once. The logic went something like this. Common people were dirty because they worked with their hands, sweated in fields, and lived like animals. But nobles? Nobles were inherently clean. Their blood was purer, their bodies naturally resistant to the corruptions that plagued the lower classes. Bathing would actually insult God by suggesting his favoured children needed such crude maintenance. Lady Isabel's morning routine makes Aldrich's herb rubbing look positively primitive. She wakes in a bed with sheets that cost more than a peasant family makes in a year. These sheets are changed daily, sometimes twice daily if she's feeling particularly pure. Her ladies-in-waiting are already preparing for the 2-hour ordeal that is getting their mistress ready to face the day. First comes the linen ceremony. Not just 1 layer of undergarments, but 3, sometimes 4. Each piece is so fine it's almost transparent, made from linen so soft it feels like wearing clouds. If clouds smelled faintly of lavender and last Tuesday's roast peacock, the changing of these garments is done with the solemnity of a religious ritual. Each piece removed is whisked away as if contaminated. Each new piece presented like a holy relic. Then comes the perfuming. Oh, the perfuming. Lady Isabel has an entire chamber dedicated to her scent collection, bottles and vials from across the known world. Attar of roses from Damascus, musk from Tibet, ambergris from Wales, which is exactly as gross as it sounds, but apparently smells divine. These aren't just dabbed on wrists and neck. They're incorporated into every layer of clothing, rubbed into hair, even mixed into the powder that will be applied to her face. The powder is its own adventure. White lead mixed with ground pearls when the budget allows, applied thick enough to crack if she smiles too widely. Which is fine, because excessive smiling is undignified anyway. The lead might be slowly poisoning her, causing headaches and mood swings, but at least she has that fashionable corpse-like pallor that suggests she's too refined to have blood flow like a common peasant. Her hair hasn't been properly washed in months, but it's been brushed, oiled and perfumed so many times it has its own complex ecosystem. Her ladies spend an hour each morning creating elaborate styles, incorporating false hair pieces, pearls, and enough pins to outfit a small army. The hair is pulled so tight it gives her a perpetual expression of mild surprise, which is considered very fashionable. Meanwhile, down in the castle's great hall, Lord Robert de Montmorency is undergoing his own morning transformation. Unlike his wife, he occasionally succumbs to the temptation of water, but only under very specific circumstances. Last month, for instance, he took a bath before the feast of St. George. The preparation took 3 days. First, the castle physician had to determine if Lord Robert's humours were properly balanced for such a dangerous undertaking. Too much yellow bile? No bath. Black bile acting up? Definitely no bath. The stars had to be consulted. The calendar checked for inauspicious days. Finally, when all signs pointed to probably won't die, the bathing chamber was prepared. The tub, a massive wooden contraption that took 6 men to move, was lined with the finest linen. Not because it was comfortable, but because direct contact with wood might allow forest spirits to enter the body. The water was heated to precisely the right temperature, not too hot, never too hot, because excessive heat would open the pores to a dangerous degree. Herbs were added: sage for wisdom, rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, because apparently you needed courage to take a bath. Lord Robert entered the bath like a knight entering battle, cautious, prepared for anything, slightly afraid he might not survive the encounter. He stayed in for exactly the amount of time prescribed by his physician, not a moment longer. Too much soaking could soften the brain, weaken the constitution, and worst of all, make him susceptible to female complaints. The drying process was even more elaborate than the bathing. No rough towels for a lord. Instead, he was wrapped in warmed linen, then more linen, then a fur robe. He was carried, yes, carried, to a bed where he would lie for at least an hour while his body recovered from the trauma of being clean. Wine was administered medicinally, prayers were said, and everyone pretended not to notice that he smelled significantly better than he had that morning. But these full baths were rare enough to be memorable. Most of the time, Lord Robert maintained his hygiene the same way his wife did, through elaborate clothing changes, strategic perfuming, and the firm belief that noble blood was self-cleaning. The real performance happened in public. When Lord and Lady de Montmorency held court, received visitors, or attended church, they were walking advertisements for waterless cleanliness. Every gesture was calculated to waft perfume, every movement designed to show off fresh linen, every word spoken through teeth rubbed with coral powder and breath sweetened with anise seeds. They had servants whose only job was managing smells. The castle's keeper of the wardrobe didn't just maintain clothes. He was a master of scent layering. Each garment was stored with specific herbs, aired at specific times, and perfumed according to the season. Winter clothes got heavier, muskier scents. Summer clothes got lighter, floral notes. It was like having a sommelier, but for smells. The public baths, those dens of iniquity that still operated in some larger cities, were viewed by the nobility with a mixture of fascination and horror. Lady Isabel had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. mixed bathing, wine served in the water, musicians playing, while people soaked together like vegetables in a soup. The very idea made her fan herself, though whether from shock or secret interest, she'd never admit. Some nobles did visit bathhouses, but they went in disguise, like a medieval version of celebrities in sunglasses. They'd rent private rooms, bring their own servants, their own water sometimes, defeating the entire purpose but maintaining the illusion. It was the medieval equivalent of going to McDonald's in a limousine. The hypocrisy was staggering. The same nobles who preached about the dangers of bathing would spend fortunes importing soap from Spain and Italy. Not to use, heaven forbid, but to display. Beautiful, scented soaps carved like flowers or animals, sitting in silver dishes, never touching water. They were status symbols, like owning a yacht you never sail. The Montmorency castle had 3 decorative soap sculptures, one shaped like a swan, one like a rose, and one that was supposedly a lion, but looked more like a melted cat. They sat in the great hall, where visitors could admire them and understand that this was a family so wealthy they could afford not to use soap worth more than a peasant's yearly income. The medical advice nobles received was tailored to their prejudices. Court physicians, who knew which side their bread was buttered on, would write treatises on how noble constitutions were different from common ones. They'd explain that while a peasant might need occasional washing to remove the grime of labour, a noble's natural refinement meant their bodies produced a different, purer kind of sweat that actually improved with age, like wine. One famous physician wrote that the perspiration of a true nobleman contained gold particles, invisible to the eye, but present nonetheless. This golden sweat, he claimed, formed a protective barrier against disease and sin. Washing it away would be like throwing away armour before a battle. The fact that nobles paid him in actual gold for this advice was surely just a coincidence. The children of nobles were raised with these beliefs from birth. Little Lord Guillaume de Montmorency, aged 7, already knew that baths were for baptisms, deathbeds, and nothing in between. He'd been taught that his noble body was like a temple, and temples weren't scrubbed like common pots. They were reverently maintained with incense and prayer, or in his case, perfume and denial. The girls had it even more complicated. Young Lady Marguerite, at 12, was already learning the complex art of appearing clean while avoiding water. She practiced walking in ways that made her skirts swish just enough to release perfume, but not enough to disturb the carefully layered scents. She could apply face powder in her sleep and knew 17 different ways to style hair that hadn't been washed since Christmas. The marriage negotiations among nobles sometimes included clauses about bathing. No, really. When Lady Isabel's cousin married into a German family known for their suspicious enthusiasm for hot springs, the contract specifically stated she would not be required to participate in any water-based activities more than twice a year. Her family negotiated it down from 4 times. It was considered a diplomatic victory. Let's leave the perfumed halls of Castle Montmorency and descend into the real trenches of medieval life, the city streets. If you thought noble hygiene was questionable, wait until you experience a bustling medieval city through the nose of someone actually living there. Our friend Aldrich has to walk through these streets every day to get to the smithy, and let me tell you, it's an assault on senses that haven't even been invented yet. The morning starts with what medieval city dwellers cheerfully called the dawn chorus. Not birds singing, though there were plenty of those, mostly roosters who had no concept of actual dawn. No, this was the sound of hundreds of windows opening and hundreds of chamber pots being emptied, the cry of Gardelou. derived from the French garde à l'eau, or watch out for the water, echoed through the narrow streets like the world's worst alarm clock. Aldrich learned early to hug the walls and walk fast in the morning. The middle of the street was a no-man's land where all manner of horrors rained down from above. The city had ordinances about this, of course. You were supposed to wait until after dark to empty your chamber pots. You were supposed to make sure no one was walking below. You were supposed to do a lot of things that nobody actually did. The streets themselves were marvels of medieval engineering, if by marvel you mean, how did anyone survive this? Most weren't paved, just packed earth that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. The lucky streets had cobblestones, which sounds nice until you realise that cobblestones create perfect little pockets for collecting every disgusting thing a medieval city could produce. And boy, could medieval cities produce disgusting things. Every house, shop, and tavern contributed to the street soup. Kitchen waste, human waste, animal waste, industrial waste, from tanners and dyers and butchers. It all mingled together in a symphony of stenches that would make a modern person pass out within minutes. Medieval noses were made of sterner stuff, or maybe they just gave up and died, leaving only the strongest smell receptors to soldier on. The animals added their own special charm. Horses, obviously, doing what horses do with enthusiastic regularity, but also pigs, which were the medieval equivalent of garbage disposals. They roamed the streets freely, eating whatever they could find, which was plenty. Chickens pecked around in the muck. Dogs and cats hunted rats, which were so numerous they were considered a feature, not a bug. Sometimes literally, as the fleas they carried were about to demonstrate in spectacular fashion. But here's the thing that would really blow your modern mind. People adapted. They didn't just survive these conditions, they thrived in them. They developed systems, unwritten rules, and a complex social etiquette around navigating their filthy world. Take the wooden patterns, for instance. These were like medieval platform shoes, wooden soles that strapped to your regular shoes to lift you a few precious inches above the muck. The click-clack of patterns on cobblestones was the soundtrack of medieval city life. Rich merchants had elaborate carved patterns. Poor workers had simple wooden blocks. But everyone had them because the alternative was, well, let's not think about the alternative. The truly wealthy had another solution. They simply didn't walk. Carried in litters or riding horses, they sailed above the common filth-like ships over a very disturbing sea. Lady Isabel, on the rare occasion she ventured into town, travelled in a covered litter with perfumed cushions and small windows that could be quickly shut if the smell became too overwhelming, which was always. But for working people like Aldrich, the street was unavoidable. He developed what all city dwellers developed, a kind of mental map of the least disgusting routes. This street was better in the morning before the butchers started work. That alley was to be avoided on Fridays, when the fishmongers dumped their week's worth of unsold goods. The area around the public latrine was, obviously, a permanent no-go zone, unless absolutely necessary. Oh yes, public latrines. Let's talk about those architectural marvels. If you were lucky, your city had public latrines built over rivers or streams. The constant flow of water would carry away the waste to become someone else's problem downstream. London had several built over the Thames, with charming names like Whittington's Longhouse, which was exactly as long and horrifying as it sounds. These weren't private affairs. Medieval people had different concepts of privacy. You'd sit on a long bench with holes cut in it, doing your business while chatting with your neighbour about the weather, the price of bread, or the latest gossip about who was definitely going to hell for taking too many baths. Some latrines had up to 60 seats. 60! It was like a very specific and very terrible kind of social club. For those who couldn't make it to a public latrine, there were entrepreneurial individuals with buckets who would, for a small fee, provide a mobile toilet service. They'd carry these buckets through the streets, ringing bells to announce their presence. When full, these buckets would be emptied into larger containers and eventually taken outside the city walls to the depressingly named dung hills, where the waste would be composted and sold to farmers. The circle of life was more of a circle of, well, you get the idea. The smell management industry was huge. Street vendors sold nosegays, small bouquets of flowers and herbs that people held to their noses while walking. Pomandas, those ball-shaped containers filled with spices and perfumes, weren't just fashion accessories, they were survival equipment. The wealthy had elaborate pomanders made of silver or gold, with intricate patterns that allowed the scent to escape. The poor made do with oranges stuck with cloves or small cloth bags filled with whatever herbs they could find. Some enterprising merchants sold what they claimed were plague preventatives, special herb mixtures that would protect you from disease if you sniffed them regularly. The ingredients usually included things like wormwood, rue, and sage mixed with vinegar. Did they work? Absolutely not. Did people buy them anyway? Absolutely yes. Hope smells better than despair, even if both are mixed with vinegar. The actual plague, when it came, turned city hygiene from bad to apocalyptic. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The normal systems of waste removal broke down. The few remaining healthy people were too terrified to clean anything. Cities that were already struggling with sanitation became literal hellscapes. But even during normal, non-plague times, disease was a constant companion in medieval cities. The connection between filth and illness was vaguely understood, but the solution was usually more perfume, not more cleaning. It was like trying to fix a broken leg with prettier bandages. The guilds tried to maintain some standards. The Bakers' Guild had rules about keeping bread away from ground level. The Brewers' Guild insisted on cleanish water for beer making. The Butchers' Guild required members to dispose of offal properly, though properly often meant in the street, but not directly in front of your own shop. There were even medieval health inspectors of a sort, city officials who would walk around with very serious faces, pointing at particularly egregious piles of filth and demanding they be moved. Where? Somewhere else. Always somewhere else. It was a medieval version of not my problem anymore. The irony was that everyone complained about the smell and filth, but no one wanted to pay for proper infrastructure. Sound familiar? Taxes for public works were about as popular as, well, taxes have ever been. So cities muddled along, adding a law here, a regulation there, but never addressing the fundamental problem that hundreds of thousands of people producing waste with nowhere proper to put, it was always going to end badly. Markets were particularly intense experiences. Imagine hundreds of vendors in a small square, each with their own contribution to the olfactory assault. Fish that had travelled for days without refrigeration. Meat hanging in the open air, developing that special patina that medieval people generously called aged. Vegetables that were either fresh from fields fertilized with human waste or old enough to qualify as science experiments. All of this under a hot sun, with thousands of people pressed together, none of whom had bathed recently. Yet this was where Aldrich came to buy food for his family. He'd learned to shop early, before the sun really got cooking. He knew which vendors were trustworthy and which sold meat that was more maggot than muscle. He could tell by smell alone whether fish was fresh enough to risk eating. These were survival skills as important as any sword-fighting technique. Now, in all this aromatic chaos, you might wonder, were there any rebels? Any clean revolutionaries who dared to challenge the great unwashed status quo? The answer is yes, and their stories are both inspiring and slightly insane. Let's meet Margaret the Wise. Though behind her back, people called her Margaret the Wet. She was a merchant's widow who had travelled to the Holy Land in her youth and seen the bathhouses of Constantinople. The experience had changed her life. While her neighbours were perfecting the art of dry rubbing, Margaret was secretly filling wooden tubs in her back courtyard and submerging herself in actual water. The scandal! Margaret wasn't completely reckless. She knew that openly bathing would mark her as either a witch or a prostitute, possibly both. So she developed an elaborate system of subterfuge. She'd heat water over her kitchen fire late at night, claiming she was dyeing cloth. She'd carry it out to a small shed in her garden, supposedly for storing the fabric. What she was actually doing was soaking in herb-infused water while reading by candlelight, living her best clean life in secret. The neighbours were suspicious, of course. Why did Margaret's garden always smell like lavender and rosemary? Why did she buy so much firewood when she lived alone? And why, most suspiciously of all, did she never seem to smell quite as bad as everyone else? Rumours spread. Maybe she had made a deal with water spirits. Maybe she was practicing foreign magic. Maybe she was just very, very committed to her supposed cloth dyeing business. Margaret wasn't alone in her secret water worship. There was a whole underground network of bathing enthusiasts, meeting in secret like a very hygienic cult. They'd share recipes for bath oils, trade soap from foreign lands, and discuss the latest medical theories from Arab physicians who, shockingly, believed washing was actually good for you. These rebels faced real dangers. A woman in Paris was accused of witchcraft, partly because she was seen bathing too often. Too often, in this case, meant monthly. A merchant in Venice was boycotted by his guild for suggesting that maybe, just maybe, washing your hands before handling food was a good idea. He ended up moving to Constantinople, where such radical ideas were welcome. The monasteries were interesting battlegrounds in the war between cleanliness and godliness. Some religious orders embraced filth as a form of penance. The dirtier you were, the closer to God. Saint Benedict's rule limited baths to the sick and the very young. Healthy monks were expected to offer up their itchiness and smell as a sacrifice to the Lord. But other orders, particularly those with connections to the Eastern churches, or those who actually read ancient medical texts, quietly maintained bathing practices. The Cistercians, for example, had elaborate water systems in their monasteries, officially for agriculture and cooking. Unofficially, Brother Francis wasn't spending that much time in the turnip washing room for the vegetables' sake. There's a wonderful account from the Abbey of Cluny, where the abbot had to issue a decree limiting baths to major feast days, only because the younger monks were getting too enthusiastic about cleanliness. Imagine being told you're too clean for God. The theological gymnastics required to explain why the Lord preferred his servants crusty is mind-boggling. The real heroes of medieval hygiene were often the Jewish communities. Jewish religious law required ritual bathing, hand-washing before meals, and general cleanliness that made their Christian neighbours deeply suspicious. During plague outbreaks, Jewish communities often suffered lower death rates, which led to accusations of poisoning wells or practicing dark magic. The actual explanation, they washed their hands and bathed regularly, was apparently too radical to consider. This led to some tragic ironies. Jewish bathhouses were burned down by mobs convinced they were sources of corruption. Jewish physicians who recommended washing were accused of trying to weaken Christian souls. The fact that these physicians' patients tended to survive more often was seen as evidence of demonic assistance rather than, basic hygiene. There were also the travelling merchants who brought dangerous ideas from foreign lands. Men who had seen the bathhouses of Baghdad, the hot springs of Iceland, the steam baths of Russia. They'd return with wild tales of people who bathed weekly, even daily, and somehow hadn't immediately died or gone to hell. Some tried to recreate these foreign bathing customs at home. A wool merchant named Peter of Ghent built what he called a Turkish bath in his house after a trip to Constantinople. It was essentially a small room where he poured water on hot stones to create steam. His neighbours were convinced he was summoning demons. The amount of smoke certainly didn't help. Neither did Peter's habit of emerging red-faced and sweating, looking exactly like someone who had just had a vigorous argument with Satan. The bathing rebels had their own patron saints, sort of. Saint Elizabeth of Hungary was known for personally washing the feet of the poor, which was seen as incredibly holy rather than dangerously clean, because it was for others, not herself. The logic of medieval morality was like a pretzel, twisted in ways that made sense only if you didn't think about it too hard. There were practical rebels too. Midwives who insisted on washing their hands before delivering babies, despite accusations of bringing bad luck. Surgeons who cleaned their instruments between patients, revolutionary thinking that wouldn't become standard for centuries. These medical rebels often learned their techniques from Arabic texts, translated in secret and shared like forbidden knowledge. The bathhouse owners who still operated formed their own shadow economy. They couldn't advertise openly, but everyone knew where to find them. They operated like medieval speakeasies, with secret knocks and passwords. "I hear you sell very hot bread," a customer might say, and the owner would nod and lead them to the back where the tubs were waiting. These remaining bathhouses became fascinating melting pots of society. You'd find merchants who needed to clean up before important deals, travellers who hadn't quite adapted to local anti-bathing customs, prostitutes who found cleanliness was good for business, and the occasional noble slumming it in disguise. The conversations in these places must have been incredible. Nothing breaks down social barriers quite like sitting in hot water together, pretending you're not doing something vaguely illegal. Some cities tried to regulate rather than ban bathing entirely. Florence, for instance, had laws about which days bathhouses could operate, how hot the water could be, and who could bathe together. The regulations were so complex they required a university education to understand, which was probably the point. Make bathing so legally complicated that people gave up and stayed dirty. The artists and intellectuals of the time had mixed feelings about cleanliness. Some poets wrote odes to the pure, unwashed state of humanity. Others penned secret verses about the joys of hot water and soap. Leonardo da Vinci designed elaborate bathing machines that would never be built, not because they wouldn't work, but because no one wanted them to. There's a particularly sad story of a young woman named Elisande who inherited a fortune from her merchant father. She used part of it to build a beautiful private bathhouse in her garden, complete with heated floors and perfumed waters. She invited her friends to join her, thinking she was offering them a wonderful gift. Instead, she found herself socially ostracized. The bathhouse stood empty, while Elisande learned to rub herself with dry cloths like everyone else, her brief, clean rebellion crushed by the weight of social pressure. But the rebels persisted. In their hidden tubs and secret steam rooms, they kept the flame of cleanliness alive. They were the underground railroad of hygiene, helping soap and water move through Europe's darkest, smelliest times. They risked reputation, freedom, and sometimes their lives. all for the radical belief that being clean was not a sin. As our journey through the great unwashed ages continues, we need to address a burning question. How did people find love in a world where everyone smelled like a combination of old cheese and existential dread? How did romance bloom in the garden of body odour? Buckle up, dear listeners, because medieval courtship was a wild ride through a landscape of strategic perfuming and competitive not bathing. Young Aldrich, our blacksmith's apprentice, was experiencing this firsthand. At 23, he'd noticed Cecily, the baker's daughter. She had eyes like fresh bread, brown and warm, a smile that could light up even the dingiest tavern, and she smelled only moderately terrible. By medieval standards, she was basically a supermodel. The courtship began, as all medieval romances did, with strategic positioning. Aldrich would time his walk past the bakery for when the wind was blowing the right direction, carrying the smell of fresh bread toward him rather than the smell of himself toward her. He'd chew mint leaves beforehand, rub extra sage under his arms, and try to look casual while mouth-breathing to avoid inhaling too deeply. Cecily, for her part, was engaged in her own olfactory warfare. She discovered that standing near the ovens not only kept her warm, but also infused her clothes with the smell of baking bread, nature's own perfume. She'd also learned that flour, liberally applied, could serve as both a dry shampoo and a kind of primitive deodorant. She was basically a walking bakery, which in medieval terms was irresistible. The economics of smell played a huge role in medieval romance. A suitor who could afford real perfume was advertising his wealth as surely as if he were wearing a sign saying, "I have money and I'm willing to spend it on not smelling like a latrine." Young men would save for months to buy a small vial of rose oil or musk, applying it with the care of someone defusing a bomb. The actual courting rituals were hilarious by modern standards. Dancing, for instance, required careful choreography, not just of steps, but of distance. Too close, and you'd overwhelm your partner with your personal aroma. Too far, and you'd seem disinterested. The ideal distance was what scholars called the cologne zone, close enough to show interest, far enough to maintain the illusion that you didn't smell like you'd been sleeping in a stable, which you probably had. Love letters were popular partly because they involved no actual physical proximity. A young man could pour his heart out on parchment without worrying that his beloved would get a whiff of what 3 months without a bath actually smelled like. The letters themselves were often perfumed, sprinkled with rose water or stored with herbs. Receiving a scented letter was the medieval equivalent of getting flowers, except the flowers were invisible and the sentiment was, "I acknowledge that we both smell terrible, but I'm trying." Noble courtship was even more elaborate. Remember Lady Isabel's younger sister, Lady Constance? At 16, she was being courted by Sir Raymond de Toulouse, a knight who had spent 3 years on campaign and apparently brought most of the campaign back with him in his beard. Their courtship was a masterclass in medieval romance navigation. Sir Raymond would arrive at the castle for his wooing sessions, armed with enough perfume to fell a horse. He'd been known to stand in smoke from burning herbs before entering, like some kind of aromatic ritual cleansing. His servant would walk before him with a censer, supposedly to honour his noble presence, but really to create a smell barrier between him and the world. Lady Constance would prepare for these visits like a general preparing for battle. Layers of fresh linen, each scented differently, hair oiled and perfumed until it gleamed, face powdered until she looked like she'd been rolled in flour, hands washed in rosewater no less than 6 times. She'd sit in her solar, surrounded by burning herbs, creating a defensive perimeter of pleasant smells. Their actual interactions were fascinating. They'd sit at carefully calculated distances, usually with something between them, a table, a chessboard, a very understanding chaperone. They'd exchange gifts that were basically smell delivery systems. He'd give her gloves scented with ambergris. She'd give him a handkerchief soaked in lavender water. It was like trading biological weapons, but romantic. The poetry of the time reflects this reality. Troubadours sang of ladies whose breath was like roses, which sounds romantic until you realize they were specifically celebrating the absence of halitosis. One famous poem praised a maiden whose sweet scent overcame the stable's earthly perfume, which is basically saying she smelled better than horse manure. The bar was not high. Wedding nights must have been adventures in themselves. Imagine spending months courting someone from a safe olfactory distance, then suddenly being expected to share a bed. Many marriage contracts included provisions for pre-wedding bathing. Both parties would take ceremonial baths, often their first in months or years. It was probably the cleanest they'd be for the rest of their married lives. The wedding bath was a ritual loaded with symbolism. The water would be blessed by a priest, herbs would be added for fertility and good fortune, and the whole thing would be overseen by matrons who would ensure nothing too enjoyable happened. After all, this was medical bathing, not recreational splashing. Some couples try to maintain the illusion after marriage. There are accounts of husbands and wives who slept in separate beds, not because of marital discord, but because of what one chronicle delicately called nocturnal aromatics. They'd visit each other for conjugal purposes, then retreat to their own chambers where they could breathe freely. The really wealthy had creative solutions. Perfumed sheets changed daily. Herbs hung from bed curtains. Some even had early versions of aromatherapy, with servants instructed to burn specific incenses at specific times. More lavender, the master is approaching, must have been a common cry in noble bedchambers. For common folks like Aldrich and Cecily, romance was earthier, literally. Their courtship involved a lot of outdoor activities, not because they loved nature, but because the wind helped. A romantic walk meant finding the breeziest hill. A picnic meant sitting far enough apart that you could pretend the smell was coming from the cheese. The seasons played a huge role in medieval romance. Winter was cuddle season, not just because it was cold, but because frozen noses smell less. Summer was challenging, all that heat, all that sweat, all that fermenting humanity. Many engagements happened in winter and broke off by August, victims of the cruel reality of medieval summer stench. There were practical considerations too. Women looked for men who could afford soap, even if they didn't use it. It was potential cleanliness that mattered. Men looked for women who showed attention to whatever hygiene was possible. Cleanish hair, white teeth, hands that didn't look like they'd been digging turnips barehanded. The guild rules added another layer of complexity. Some guilds had hygiene requirements for members. Bakers had to wash their hands. Butchers had to clean their aprons. Dating within these relatively cleaner professions was like hitting the medieval lottery. My betrothed is a baker, a young woman might brag. He washes his hands every week. There were even medieval beauty tips passed between women. How to make your hair shine without washing it. Lots of brushing and oil. How to keep your breath fresh. Chew fennel seeds. How to make your skin look clean. Lead powder, which was toxic, but who's counting. How to smell attractive. Stand near flowers and hope for the best. The church had opinions about romantic hygiene, because of course it did. Too much attention to physical appearance was vanity, but too little attention might drive your spouse to sin. It was a delicate balance between being attractive enough to fulfill your marital duties, but not so attractive that you inspired lust. The fact that most people smelled like a barn actually helped with this moral tightrope. Now, as we drift toward the end of our malodorous medieval tale, we need to talk about how this great age of grime finally began to crumble, because, spoiler alert, people did eventually start bathing again. It didn't happen overnight. There was no great "Eureka, we stink" moment. Instead, it was a slow, soggy revolution that took centuries and probably killed a few people from shock. The Renaissance started creeping in like a guilty bath taker sliding into a tub. New ideas from Italy, where they'd never completely given up on Roman bathing traditions, began spreading north. Merchants returned from Venice, talking about people who washed their faces daily. Daily! The scandal spread through medieval courts like the plague, if the plague made you cleaner. Our friend Aldrich, now a master blacksmith with his own forge, and married to Cecily, the baker's daughter, lived to see the beginning of this change. His son, young William, born in 1380, grew up in a world where bathing was slowly losing its association with death and damnation. By the time William was 20, he was doing something his father would have considered insane, washing his hands before every meal, not just on Sundays. The medical profession led part of this revolution, which is ironic considering they'd spent centuries telling people that bathing would kill them. New translations of Greek and Arabic medical texts revealed that ancient physicians had recommended regular washing. Hippocrates himself had prescribed baths. The medieval doctors had some serious explaining to do. "Well," they said, stroking their still unwashed beards, "what we meant was that excessive bathing is dangerous. Moderate bathing, properly supervised, with the correct alignment of planets and humours, might possibly be acceptable. Sometimes, maybe. The real game changer was the printing press. Once books became cheaper and more widespread, dangerous ideas, like dirt causes disease and washing feels nice, could spread faster than ever before. There were actual published treatises on bathing, complete with woodcut illustrations of people in tubs looking suspiciously happy. The Protestant Reformation added another twist. If Catholic doctrine had associated bathhouses with sin, some Protestant reformers went the other direction. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was godliness. God gave you a body. The least you could do was wash it occasionally. This led to some amusing theological debates about exactly how much washing God required. Monthly? Weekly? The really radical Anabaptists were rumoured to bathe before every service, which was clearly taking things too far. Trade routes expanded, bringing new hygiene products from around the world. Soap from Castile became the Louis Vuitton handbag of the Renaissance. Men, everyone who was anyone, had to have it. Even if they didn't use it. Especially if they didn't use it. Display soap became even more elaborate. Entire soap sculptures depicting biblical scenes, which seems like missing the point, but progress is progress. The age of exploration brought back tales of people in the Americas who bathed in rivers daily and somehow weren't all dead. This was deeply confusing to European minds. How could these savages survive such frequent water exposure? Maybe European bodies were just built different? Maybe noble European pores were more sensitive than common native ones? The mental gymnastics were Olympic level. Cities began to realise that maybe, just maybe, having streets full of human waste wasn't ideal. London started building actual sewers. Revolutionary technology that meant you could walk down a street without playing hopscotch over puddles of unmentionable origin. Paris followed suit, though they made their sewers beautiful because they were French and had standards. Public bathhouses began creeping back, but with new rules to avoid the moral panic of the medieval era. Separate facilities for men and women. No wine serving, no music. No fun basically, but at least you could get clean. They were like very boring spas where enjoyment was strictly prohibited, but cleanliness was grudgingly allowed. The fashion world drove some of the change. As clothing became more elaborate and expensive, people realized that maybe preserving these investments required occasionally washing the body underneath them. Novel concept. Underwear evolved from simple linen shifts to more complex garments that could be changed more frequently, allowing the illusion of cleanliness to improve even if actual cleanliness lagged behind. Perfume technology advanced too. The discovery of alcohol as a base for scents meant perfumes lasted longer and smelled stronger. This was both good and bad. Good, because you could cover more stench. Bad, because everyone was doing it, leading to olfactory arms races where social gatherings smelled like someone had blown up a flower shop. But the real heroes of the hygiene revolution were ordinary people who just got tired of smelling terrible. Women like Cecily, who insisted on washing their children's faces daily, scandalized grandmothers be damned. Men like William, who discovered that washing before work meant fewer infections from metal cuts. Practical people making practical decisions that slowly changed cultural norms. The transition wasn't smooth. There were bathing riots in some German cities where conservatives tried to shut down new public baths. There were families torn apart by different hygiene standards. Imagine the drama when young Elizabeth announced she was bathing monthly and her parents threatened to disown her for such reckless behaviour. The generation gap was real. Aldrich, in his old age, would shake his head at his grandchildren splashing water on their faces every morning. In my day, he'd mutter, we were tough. We didn't need water to feel clean. We had dirt, and we were grateful for it. The grandchildren would nod politely while secretly planning their next illicit bath. Some of the old fears died hard. Well into the 16th century, there were still physicians warning that too much bathing could lead to weakness, madness, or spontaneous feminization in men. Queen Elizabeth I's famous monthly bath was considered daringly frequent. When her successor, James I, reportedly never bathed at all, conservatives nodded approvingly. Finally, a monarch who understood proper hygiene. The poor, ironically, was sometimes quicker to adopt new bathing habits than the rich. When you work with your hands, cleanliness has practical benefits. A clean wound heals better. Clean hands don't contaminate food. The nobility could afford to pay for their principled filthiness with higher mortality rates. Universities became battlegrounds between pro and anti-bathing factions. Young medical students, influenced by new anatomical knowledge, argued for regular washing. Old professors clutched their unwashed robes and predicted doom. Thesis defences on the benefits of bathing could turn into shouting matches, which must have been particularly unpleasant given the participants' hygiene standards. The artists of the High Renaissance didn't help matters by painting all those clean-looking Greek gods and goddesses. Botticelli's Venus emerging from the sea, looking radiant, probably did more for the pro-bathing movement than 100 medical treatises. People wanted to look like the figures in paintings, and those figures definitely didn't look like they'd been avoiding water for 6 months. By the time the 1500s rolled around, bathing was making a real comeback. Not daily bathing, let's not get crazy, but regular enough that people started to notice when someone didn't bathe. The smell baseline was shifting. What was once normal now stood out. The unwashed were becoming the exception rather than the rule, at least in progressive cities. But perhaps the most telling sign of change was the language. New words entered common usage. Cleanliness stopped being primarily a spiritual concept. Hygiene arrived from Greek via medical Latin. Sanitation suggested that cities could be something other than open sewers with buildings. The vocabulary of cleanliness expanded because people needed words for concepts they were finally starting to embrace. The old bathhouses were rebuilt, but different. Gone were the communal tubs where dozens of people would soak in the same increasingly suspicious water. In came private chambers, fresh water for each bather, and strict time limits. It was less fun but more hygienic, which seemed to be the Renaissance motto for everything. And so, dear insomniacs, we reach the end of our journey through the great, unwashed centuries. But before you drift off to sleep in your freshly laundered sheets, having showered sometime in recent memory, let's take one last look at the legacy of medieval hygiene and what it tells us about human nature, progress, and the remarkable ability of our ancestors to survive absolutely anything. By the dawn of the 1700s, the world had fundamentally changed. The great-great-grandchildren of people who feared water like vampires were now taking weekly baths. Weekly! The decadence! The medical establishment had done a complete 180, now prescribing regular bathing for everything from melancholy to gout. The same institutions that had warned against the mortal dangers of open pores were now opening therapeutic bathhouses where you could soak your troubles away. But the journey from filth to cleanliness wasn't just about changing habits, it was about changing minds. For centuries, people had constructed elaborate philosophical, theological, and medical justifications for not bathing. They'd built entire worldviews around the idea that dirt was protective, godly even. Dismantling those beliefs took more than just soap and water. It took a fundamental shift in how people understood their bodies, their health, and their relationship with the natural world. Think about old Aldrich, who we met at the beginning of our tale, waking up on that straw mattress, accepting his grime as natural as breathing. His great-great-grandson would wake up in a world where not washing your face in the morning marked you as either desperately poor or slightly insane. In just a few generations, the entire concept of normal had shifted. The transformation wasn't complete, of course. Even today, there are echoes of medieval hygiene attitudes. Ever met someone who insists that washing their hair too often is bad for it? That's a direct descendant of medieval pore theory. The idea that being too clean makes you weak. Medieval doctors would nod approvingly. The notion that natural body oils are protective? Thank a medieval physician. But perhaps the most interesting legacy is what this whole smelly saga tells us about human adaptability. For hundreds of years, millions of people lived in conditions that would make a modern person faint. They fell in love, raised families, created art, built cathedrals, and wrote poetry, all while smelling like a dumpster fire in August. Life found a way, even if that way involved a lot of mouth breathing. The medieval period also shows us how powerful social pressure can be. When everyone agrees that bathing is dangerous, it becomes dangerous, not physically, but socially. When the tide turned and cleanliness became fashionable again, the same people who had proudly cultivated their protective crust of dirt suddenly discovered the joys of soap. We like to think we're rational beings, but we're really just very clean sheep, following whatever hygiene trend our society demands. There's something almost touching about the elaborate systems medieval people developed to deal with their self-imposed squalor. The herbs, the perfumes, the careful social distances, the linen-changing rituals, it was all so much more complicated than just taking a bath would have been. But humans are nothing, if not creative, in their suffering. The class dynamics are fascinating too. The poor couldn't afford not to notice when dirt caused problems. A farmer with an infected cut learned quickly that cleaning wounds helped them heal. A baker with dirty hands saw the connection to sick customers. Meanwhile, the nobility could afford to ignore reality, wrapped in their perfumed delusions until the Renaissance finally made being clean fashionable again. And what about love in the time of cholera-level hygiene? The fact that people managed to find romance, marry, and produce children despite everyone smelling like a medieval garbage pit is either profoundly romantic or profoundly disturbing, probably both. It certainly puts modern dating complaints into perspective. He doesn't text back fast enough seems trivial, compared to he hasn't bathed since last Christmas, and his beard appears to be hosting an ecosystem. The medical establishment's complete flip-flop on bathing should make us humble about our own certainties. The same authorities who swore that bathing would kill you later swore with equal conviction that not bathing would kill you. Both times they had elaborate theories, confident explanations, and absolutely no idea what they were talking about. It's a good reminder that today's medical certainty might be tomorrow's. Can you believe they thought that? The slow return of bathing also shows how progress really happens. Not in great leaps, but in tiny, tentative steps. First, maybe we'll wash our hands on feast days, then maybe before every meal. Then maybe our faces too, then maybe, if we're feeling really wild, our whole bodies, once a year, then twice, then monthly. Each generation pushing the boundary of cleanliness just a little further until their ancestors' normal became their unthinkable. There's also something beautiful about the rebels we met along the way. Margaret the Wise, with her secret bathtub, the underground network of bathing enthusiasts. The Jewish communities maintaining their cleanliness despite persecution. The midwives washing their hands despite accusations of witchcraft. They kept the flame of hygiene alive during the dark, smelly ages. They were the guardians of soap, the defenders of water, the heroes we needed but didn't deserve. The story of medieval bathing is really a story about fear. Fear of disease, fear of sin, fear of social judgment, fear of change. Those fears created a world where people would rather smell like a rotting whale than risk a bath. But eventually, different fears won out. Fear of being the smelly one when everyone else was getting cleaner. Fear of missing out on Renaissance fashion that required a cleaner body underneath. Fear of being left behind as the world moved forward. Today, we live in an age of abundant hot water, endless soap varieties, and showers that can simulate everything from gentle rain to a violent hurricane. We have body washes for every mood, shampoos for every hair type, and enough hygiene products to stock a medieval castle for a century. We've gone from fearing water to practically living in it. But before you judge our ancestors too harshly, remember this: they survived. They built civilizations, created art that still takes our breath away, and made scientific discoveries that laid the groundwork for our modern world. They did all of this while smelling like hot garbage in a heatwave. If that's not inspiring, I don't know what is. So tonight, as you lay in your clean sheets, having brushed your teeth with minty paste instead of ash and vinegar, having showered with water that's actually clean and intentionally heated, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Your medieval ancestors would be either amazed at your cleanliness or horrified by your open pores, probably both. And the next time someone complains about having to shower before a social event, remind them that their ancestors would have considered that an invitation to death. We've come a long way from the days when bathing was basically considered attempted suicide. The bells of the distant chapel are tolling midnight now, and our tale is done. You've travelled through centuries of creative hygiene solutions, witnessed the rise and fall of the great unwashed, and smelled things through description that hopefully you'll never smell in real life. Thank you for gathering around our digital campfire for this aromatic adventure through history. If you enjoyed discovering why your ancestors were terrified of bathtubs, make sure to subscribe for more tales from history's stranger chapters. Ring the bell, leave a like, and remember, every time you take a shower, you're participating in a radical act that would have scandalized most of human history. Until next time, fellow insomniacs and midnight wanderers, sleep well, dream clean, and remember, no matter how bad your day was, at least you don't have to navigate romance in a world where everyone smells like a medieval latrine. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with soap, hot water, and the radical luxury of modern plumbing.